Stay away from our marriage, Eleanor. You're not welcome here. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee still hung in the air between us. Outside, golden leaves fell silently across the small garden I'd tended for 3 months. The morning light cast long shadows across Rebecca's face as she delivered those words, not shouted, but measured and cold, like a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. My son Thomas sat beside her, his large hands, so much like his father's, gripping a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from, his eyes fixed on the wooden table I'd polished just yesterday. "Thomas?" I whispered, searching his face for any sign of defense. He finally looked up, his eyes clouded with something between guilt and relief. "Maybe it's for the best, Mom." And with those 6 words, my world collapsed for the second time in less than a year. Let me tell you what led to that moment. My name is Eleanor Bennett. I'm 67 years old, and for almost my entire adult life, I thought I knew my place in the world. I was Harold's wife for 45 years, Thomas's mother, a piano teacher with 28 students at my peak, a gardener who could coax roses from Vermont's stubborn soil, a woman who built her life around the warmth of family and the certainty of belonging. Then Harold died. A heart attack. Sudden and cruel, while fixing the grandfather clock in his workshop. 1 minute he was humming an old Beatles song, the next, silence. The kind of silence that expands until it fills every corner of your life. Our house in Cedar Falls, a small community 30 minutes outside Burlington, became too large, too empty. The floorboards creaked at night, but it wasn't Harold coming in late from his workshop. The rooms echoed with memories that had nowhere to go. I spent 3 months wandering those empty rooms like a ghost in my own life. I'd wake up reaching for Harold's warmth, only to find cold sheets and the reality that crashes down anew each morning. I'd make coffee for 2, then stand staring at the extra cup until it grew cold. I'd start sentences with, "We should," before remembering there was only me. It was Thomas who suggested I move into their guest room. "Just until you get used to being alone, Mom," he said during one of his Sunday visits. His eyes were kind, concerned. He looked so much like Harold when he tilted his head that way. Rebecca smiled and nodded beside him, though something flickered behind her eyes. Hesitation, perhaps. But in my persistent naivety, always my weakness, I missed the signs. "It would be good for Oliver to have his grandmother around," Thomas added, mentioning my 12-year-old grandson, "and we have plenty of space." Their home in Burlington was modern and spacious, so different from the creaking colonial Harold and I had shared for 4 decades. Clean lines, minimal decoration, everything in its perfect place. Rebecca was an interior designer, and their house looked like it belonged in a magazine, beautiful but untouched, as if waiting for real life to begin. I moved in on a Tuesday. Thomas carried my 2 suitcases upstairs to the guest room overlooking the backyard. Rebecca showed me where everything was kept in the kitchen, her voice pleasant but formal, like a hotel concierge. Oliver hugged me tight and asked if I would help with his history project about World War II. "Your grandfather would have loved that," I told him, my throat tightening. He knew everything about that period. During those first weeks, everything seemed to work well. I helped with Oliver while they worked. Rebecca at her design studio downtown, Thomas at the architectural firm where he'd been made partner the previous year. I prepared dinners, tidied the house, and planted flowers in their neglected garden beds, small tasks that gave me purpose and, I thought, lightened their load. The first turning point came when I found Rebecca crying in the kitchen late one night. The house was dark except for the soft glow above the sink. Her shoulders shook silently as she stood with her back to me. "Rebecca?" I stepped closer, my hand hovering above her shoulder. "What's wrong, dear?" She straightened immediately, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Nothing. It's nothing." She moved away from my touch. "Just tired. Work stress." I nodded, understanding the need for privacy. "Would you like some tea? Your mother always said chamomile fixes everything." Something hardened in her eyes. "No, I'm fine. And please don't mention my mother." She left me standing alone in the kitchen, confused and hurt. The next morning, I noticed she had rearranged the cupboards I had organized. A small change, but a warning I ignored. Then came the small tensions. Rebecca began rejecting my dinners, saying she was trying to eat healthier. Oliver was instructed to do his homework alone because Grandma doesn't know modern teaching methods. Doors began closing when I approached. Everything truly changed when Susan Wright, an old family friend and widow like myself, came to visit. We were animatedly discussing old times when Rebecca walked in and overheard Susan say, "Thomas is so lucky to have you here, Eleanor. Harold would be so proud to see how you're holding this family together." The look on Rebecca's face at that moment, cold, cutting, full of resentment, should have warned me. The next day, I discovered my family photographs, which I had discreetly placed in the hallway, had been moved to my bedroom. One night, I overheard Thomas and Rebecca arguing in hushed tones in their bedroom. "She's taking my place, Thomas, in my own home." Rebecca's voice trembled. "It's not intentional," my son replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do you know what Oliver said today? He said Grandma's lasagna is better than mine. He said Grandma knows how to make his bed just right. She's erasing me, Thomas." "That's not fair, Becca. She's just trying to help." "I don't need her help. I need my home back. My family back." That's when I realized my mistake. It wasn't just a house I had invaded, it was the emotional space of a woman trying to maintain her own home intact. I tried to retreat. I started spending more time in my room. I stopped suggesting changes to the house or routines. I made myself smaller, quieter, but it was too late. The tension escalated when Elizabeth, Rebecca's sister, came with her children for dinner. In the middle of the meal, her 8-year-old son Jack spilled juice. I automatically stood to clean it up. "I'll handle it, Eleanor," Rebecca said, her voice sharp. "This is my house." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth looked at me with pity, and that hurt more than any words. Later that night, I heard Oliver ask why Grandma was sad. Rebecca answered, "Sometimes, honey, people don't understand when they're no longer needed." Those words opened a deep wound in me. For the first time since Harold left, I cried myself to sleep. The situation worsened when I found a list of retirement homes on the computer Rebecca had left open. I wasn't meant to see it, certainly, but there it was, a search for affordable options for independent seniors. My name was noted on the notepad beside it. The message was clear. They wanted me gone. I confronted Thomas the next day when we were alone. "You want me to go to a nursing home?" I asked, my voice shaking. The look of surprise on his face seemed genuine. "What are you talking about, Mom?" When I explained what I'd seen, his face flushed with shame. Rebecca was just exploring options for the future. "For when I become a complete burden?" I asked. He didn't answer, and his silence said everything. A major turning point came when, during a tense dinner, Oliver innocently announced, "Dad, did you know Grandma was a piano teacher? She showed me some notes today." Rebecca froze. "You gave him lessons without asking me?" "He found the old photos in my room and asked," I began to explain. "We don't need piano lessons," Rebecca interrupted. "Oliver has science classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "But I liked it, Mom," Oliver protested. "It's not about what you like, it's about what you need," Rebecca responded, looking directly at me as she said need. That night, a storm hit Burlington. The rain pounded against the windows like accusations. The wind howled through the trees in the garden I had so carefully tended, tearing away the last flowers I had planted. The tension grew when Rebecca found Oliver in my room the next day, looking at a photo album of when Thomas was a child. "You're filling his head with the past," she accused me afterward. "He needs to focus on the present, on the future." "They're just stories, Rebecca, family stories," I replied. "Our family, Thomas, Oliver, and I, doesn't need to live in your stories," she said. Her words hit me like stones. Everything culminated on that fateful morning when Rebecca finally verbalized what her eyes had been saying for weeks. "Stay away from our marriage, Eleanor. You're not welcome here." 2 hours later, I stood in their living room with my packed bags waiting for the taxi. Thomas looked tormented, torn between his duty to his wife and to his mother. Oliver cried silently in the corner. Rebecca remained in the kitchen, refusing to say goodbye. "Where are you going, Grandma?" Oliver asked between sobs. "Back to our house in Cedar Falls," I answered, trying to smile. "It's time to face those empty rooms." "I'll visit you," he promised. Thomas approached, uncomfortable. "Mom, it didn't have to be this way. We could have found a place for you here in Burlington." "A nursing home, you mean?" I asked, without bitterness, just stating the fact. He didn't answer. The taxi arrived. I hugged Oliver for a long time. When I turned to Thomas, he hugged me quickly, as if afraid of being seen showing too much affection. "I'll call you," he said. In the taxi, I looked out the window at the house that, for a brief moment, I thought could be my new home. Rebecca stood at the window watching my departure. Our gazes met for an instant. There was no triumph in her look, only relief. I returned to Cedar Falls that afternoon. The house was exactly as I had left it, covered by a thin layer of dust, like my hopes. The old clock Harold had been fixing before he died was still on the living room table, stopped at the same time. The first weeks were the hardest. The phone rarely rang. Thomas called briefly on Sundays, superficial and tense conversations. Oliver tried to call me twice, but the calls were short, with Rebecca clearly nearby. It was Margaret Wilson, my 70-year-old neighbor, who pulled me out of isolation. She knocked on my door with a homemade cake and an unwavering determination not to let me sink. "You need to get up, Eleanor," she said. "Harold wouldn't want to see you like this, and you know it." Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I started giving piano lessons to neighborhood children again. I joined the Cedar Falls community group. Time passed, 3 months, 6 months. The pain diminished, but never completely disappeared. The major turning point happened on a rainy Sunday when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Rebecca alone, soaked by the rain and visibly nervous. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Sitting in the living room with the ticking of Harold's clock, which I had finally fixed, marking the silence between us, Rebecca finally spoke. "I came to apologize," she said, looking at her hands, "and to explain." She then told a story I could never have imagined. Rebecca grew up in a house dominated by her own mother, Judith, a controlling woman who interfered in every aspect of her life. When she married Thomas, she vowed she would never allow another maternal figure to take control of her family. "When you moved into our house, I saw all my fears materializing," she confessed. "The way Thomas looked to you for approval, how Oliver ran to you with his stories. I felt like I was disappearing in my own home." "I never wanted to replace you," I replied, realizing the painful irony of it all. "I know that now," she said. "Thomas and I started couples therapy after you left. I realized it wasn't about you, it was about my own insecurities, my own fears." I looked at her with new eyes, seeing not a cruel woman, but a wounded person acting from her own trauma. The compassion I felt surprised me. The conversation continued for hours. We shared tears, some hesitant laughter, and finally, a mutual understanding. Before leaving, Rebecca said something I'll never forget. "You're not the mother I had, Eleanor, and I needed time to understand that." 2 weeks later, I received a call from Thomas, inviting me to dinner. "Just a visit," he clarified. "For now." The reunion was cautious, but warm. Oliver hugged me so tightly I almost lost my balance. Rebecca welcomed me with a hesitant but genuine smile. During dinner, Rebecca announced she was pregnant again, a late surprise for everyone. "We'd like you to be part of this child's life, Eleanor," she said, "in a way that works for all of us." I looked at the faces around me, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandson, and felt something I didn't expect to feel again, belonging. Not like before, not as I imagined, but something new and equally valuable. Today, 1 year later, I have my own apartment in Burlington, 10 minutes from their house. I visit twice a week, not too much, not too little. I help with Oliver and little Sarah, now 3 months old, when asked. Rebecca and I occasionally have coffee together, slowly building a friendship neither of us imagined possible. The truth I discovered through this painful journey is that family love is not a competition, nor a space that diminishes when shared. It is a constantly expanding territory, with boundaries that need to be respected, but also flexible enough to accommodate growth and change. Sometimes we need to step away to find our way back, not to the same place, but to a new space where everyone can exist without diminishing each other. The bags I packed that day didn't lead me to the end, as I feared, but to a new beginning I could never have imagined. And for that, I now understand there is profound wisdom in knowing when to leave, and even greater courage in knowing how to return, transformed, humble, and ready to love in a new way. If this story touched your heart, like and share, because sometimes hearing another woman's pain is what makes us feel less alone. The morning after Rebecca's ultimatum, I sat in a taxi with my hastily packed bags, watching Burlington's familiar streets blur through tears I refused to let fall. The driver, an older gentleman with kind eyes, kept glancing at me in the rear-view mirror. "Going somewhere nice?" asked, attempting conversation. I clutched my purse tighter. "Home," I said, though the word felt hollow. "Cedar Falls." "Beautiful area," he nodded. "Family there?" "No," I whispered. "Just me." As we pulled away from the city limits, I allowed myself one final look back. For 3 months, I'd tried to carve out a place in my son's life after Harold's death. Instead, I'd become an intruder in someone else's story. The taxi wound through the autumn-painted countryside, each mile increasing the distance between me and the family I thought needed me. The irony wasn't lost on me. How quickly one could go from essential to excessive, from wanted to unwelcome. Cedar Falls appeared on the horizon, a small cluster of traditional homes nestled against Vermont's rolling hills. When Harold and I moved here 38 years ago, we'd fallen in love with its quiet dignity, its unhurried pace. Now that same quiet felt like abandonment. "Which house, ma'am?" the driver asked as we entered the town limits. "The white colonial with blue shutters," I directed him, "on Maple Street." He pulled into the driveway of the house where I'd raised my son, celebrated anniversaries, and held Harold's hand as we grew old together. Now it stood silent, a museum of a life that no longer existed. The driver helped with my bags, concern evident in his expression. "Will you be all right, ma'am?" I nodded, handing him the fare plus a generous tip. "I've lived alone before," I said, "though never like this." The key felt cold in my hand. When I opened the door, stale air rushed out to greet me. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 3 months ago. Harold's reading glasses on the side table, his favorite sweater draped over his chair, the half-finished crossword puzzle from the day before his heart attack. I moved through the rooms like a visitor in my own past. Dust had settled over everything. The piano no one played anymore, the dining table set for 2 out of decades of habit, the wall of photographs chronicling a life of togetherness now ended. In our bedroom, my bedroom now, Harold's side remained untouched. His watch still sat on the nightstand, stopped at 7:23, the time of his death, though I hadn't planned that particular symbolism. I unpacked mechanically, returning clothes to drawers I'd emptied just months before, when Thomas convinced me that living with his family would heal my grief. How foolish I'd been to believe that a 70-year-old woman could simply slot into a new family's rhythms without causing ripples. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, every creak and groan familiar yet strange, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Outside my window, the maple tree Harold and I planted when we first moved in rustled its remaining leaves against the glass. "What do I do now?" I whispered to the empty room, not expecting an answer. None came. Morning arrived with cruel brightness. I made coffee, just 1 cup this time, and carried it to the porch where Harold and I used to watch the neighborhood come alive. Mrs. Patterson across the street was walking her corgi. She spotted me and waved, surprise evident on her face. "Eleanor, you're back," she called, crossing over. "We thought you'd moved in with Thomas for good." I forced a smile. "Just a visit. Family needed their space." Her eyes softened with understanding. "Well, we're glad to have you back. The garden committee hasn't been the same without you." That first day stretched endlessly. I cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, organized drawers already in perfect order, and finally sat at Harold's workbench in the garage, surrounded by the clocks he'd loved to repair. The grandfather clock from the living room lay in pieces, tools arranged precisely where he'd left them. I picked up his magnifying glass, examining the delicate gears. Harold had tried to teach me about clock repair for years. "You never know when it might come in handy," he'd say with a wink. I'd always laughed it off. What use did a piano teacher have for fixing timepieces? Now I wished I'd paid attention. It would be something to fill the hours that stretched before me like an empty road. That evening the phone rang. I rushed to answer it, heart leaping with hope that it might be Thomas or Oliver. "Mom?" Thomas's voice sounded distant, formal. "Thomas." I sank into Harold's chair. "How are you?" "Fine. Just checking that you got home okay." The conversation that followed was painful in its politeness. He asked about the house, the taxi ride, whether I needed anything. I asked about Oliver's science project, the weather in Burlington. Neither of us mentioned Rebecca or the real reason for my departure. "I'll call again soon," he promised before hanging up, though we both knew soon was a relative term. Days passed, then weeks. I established a routine of sorts: morning coffee, daily walks through town, afternoons reading books I'd always meant to get to. I reconnected with old friends who'd given me space after Harold's death, joined the community garden committee again, and volunteered at the local library. On the surface, I was functioning. Beneath it, I was drowning. The loneliness was physical. an ache that started in my chest each morning and spread outward until my entire body felt heavy with it. I'd catch myself speaking aloud to Harold, turning to share a thought with him, reaching for his hand in the night. Worse was the sense of failure. I'd failed at being a widow, unable to bear the emptiness of our home alone. I'd failed at being a mother-in-law, threatening rather than supporting my son's marriage. I'd failed at being a grandmother, loving too much, or perhaps in the wrong way. 1 month after my return to Cedar Falls, I sat at Harold's workbench again, the disassembled grandfather clock still waiting. I picked up the instruction manual he'd been following, its pages marked with his neat handwriting. "Nothing to it, Ellie," I could almost hear him say, "just patience and paying attention to how things fit together." That afternoon, I began learning the language of gears and springs, of balance wheels and escapements. I worked slowly, consulting Harold's notes, making mistakes and starting over. Hours passed unnoticed as I focused on this puzzle left behind by the man who'd been my compass for 45 years. 3 days later, Margaret Wilson knocked on my door. At 70, Margaret had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children alone. She carried a homemade apple cake and a determined expression. "You've been hiding long enough, Eleanor Bennett," she announced, brushing past me into the kitchen. "I'm staging an intervention." She set down the cake and turned to face me, hands on her hips. "Harold's been gone 9 months. You tried living with Thomas. It didn't work out. That's life. Now what are you going to do about it?" I blinked at her directness. "I'm managing." "Managing?" she snorted. "You're existing. There's a difference." She cut 2 slices of cake and pushed one toward me. "Eat. Then we talk." Over cake and coffee, Margaret outlined what she called my resurrection plan. I would resume teaching piano. Those fingers are too talented to waste on dust cloths. I would join her weekly dinner group of fellow widows, not to find a new husband for heaven's sake, but to remember you're still alive. And I would finish fixing Harold's clock, because that man never left anything undone, and neither should you. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing inside me. "Sometimes I think I'm disappearing, becoming invisible." Margaret reached across the table and gripped my hand, her skin papery but her grip strong. "Only if you let yourself, Eleanor. Only if you let yourself." That conversation marked the beginning of what I now think of as my second life. Not a continuation of what came before, but something new grown from the ashes of the old. I put a small advertisement in the local paper offering piano lessons. Within 2 weeks, I had 7 students, 3 children and 4 adults who'd always wanted to learn. The sound of music filled my house again, sometimes halting and imperfect, but alive. I joined Margaret's dinner group, 5 women between 65 and 82, all widowed, all rebuilding lives they never planned to live alone. They welcomed me without pity, with the understanding that comes only from shared experience. And each evening, I worked on the grandfather clock, following Harold's notes, learning through trial and error. It became a conversation with him, a way to connect across the divide of death. Thomas called every Sunday, our conversations gradually becoming less strained, but never truly comfortable. He mentioned Oliver often, but avoided discussing Rebecca. I never asked to speak with my grandson. Sensing it would cause tension, though the absence of his voice left a hole in my heart. 2 months after my return to Cedar Falls, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a hand-drawn card from Oliver with a picture of what appeared to be me at a piano, and a note. "I miss you, Grandma. Mom says I can call you on Tuesday after school." I held that card against my heart, tears flowing freely for the first time since I'd left Burlington. That Tuesday, Oliver called, and we spoke for 20 minutes about his science project, his piano practice with a new teacher, not as good as you, Grandma, and his excitement about the coming school play. When we said goodbye, I heard Rebecca's voice in the background, not the words, just the tone. Gentle, encouraging. It gave me a flicker of hope. Life settled into new patterns. I taught piano 4 days a week. I met with Margaret's group every Wednesday. I volunteered at the library on Fridays. The emptiness remained, but it no longer defined me. 3 months after my return to Cedar Falls, I finished repairing the grandfather clock. I wound it carefully, holding my breath as the pendulum began to swing, and the familiar deep ticking filled the living room. The sound brought tears to my eyes, not of grief this time, but of accomplishment. "We did it, Harold," I whispered. That night I dreamt of him, not the frail man of his final years, but Harold as he was when we first met, tall with laughing eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. In the dream, he stood in our kitchen, making pancakes on Sunday morning as he always had. "You're doing fine, Ellie," he said, flipping a perfect golden circle. "Better than fine." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but a lightness in my heart I hadn't felt in months. The following Sunday, Thomas called as usual. After our typical exchange about the weather and his work, he cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been thinking. Would you like to come for dinner next weekend?" "Just dinner," he added quickly. "Rebecca's idea, actually." The invitation caught me off guard. "Dinner?" "Yes. Oliver misses you, and—" He hesitated. "We have some news to share." I agreed, of course, though anxiety knotted my stomach at the thought of returning to the house where I'd been so clearly unwanted. What news could they possibly have? Were they moving? Was Thomas changing jobs? Was Oliver having problems at school? The week crawled by. I found myself standing before my closet multiple times, trying to decide what to wear, what would make me look dignified but not formal, approachable but not desperate. In the end, I chose a simple blue dress Harold had always liked, with a cardigan and the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that showcases Vermont at its most beautiful. I drove myself to Burlington, the familiar route bringing back memories of the taxi ride 3 months earlier. This time, though, I was behind the wheel, in control of my coming and going. I parked in front of their house, taking a moment to collect myself before approaching the door. The garden I'd planted looked different. Rebecca had added her own touches, fall chrysanthemums and ornamental grasses replacing my summer flowers. It was beautiful in a different way. Not better or worse, just different. Oliver answered my knock, flinging himself into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me over. "Grandma, you came!" I hugged him tightly, inhaling the scent of his hair, feeling the slight increase in height that 3 months had brought. "Of course I came. I missed you." Thomas appeared behind him, smiling hesitantly. "Mom, good to see you." He hugged me briefly, awkwardly, as if unsure of his welcome. Rebecca stood in the kitchen doorway, watching our reunion. When our eyes met, I was surprised to see not resentment, but something like nervousness in her expression. "Eleanor," she nodded. "Thank you for coming." Dinner was a careful affair. We ate Rebecca's pot roast, delicious, though different from how I would have prepared it, and talked about safe topics, Oliver's school, Thomas's latest architectural project, the early frost predicted for next week. Oliver carried much of the conversation, eager to share everything I'd missed. I noticed how Rebecca watched him speak to me, her expression complex. Not jealousy exactly, but something more nuanced, as if she were studying a language she didn't quite understand. After dinner, while Thomas and Oliver cleared the table, Rebecca turned to me. "Would you like to see what we've done with the garden before it gets dark?" Surprised by the invitation, I nodded. We walked outside together, the evening air crisp with approaching winter. The garden beds I'd started had been expanded with stone borders and new plantings. "It's lovely," I said honestly. "You have a good eye for design." "I used what you started," she admitted, surprising me further. "The structure was good, I just added my own elements." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Then Rebecca spoke, her voice so low I almost missed it. "I'm sorry, Eleanor." I turned to look at her, this woman who had been a wall between me and my son for so long. In the gathering dusk, she seemed smaller somehow, less certain. "For what happened," she continued, "for how I behaved. It wasn't about you, not really." Before I could respond, Thomas called us inside. "Dessert's ready, and we have something to tell you, Mom." In the warmly lit dining room, over slices of apple pie, store-bought, not homemade, a small detail that spoke volumes about the changes in their lives, Thomas and Rebecca exchanged glances. "We wanted you to be the first to know," Thomas began, reaching for Rebecca's hand. "We're having another baby." The news washed over me like a wave. Another grandchild, another life, entering our complicated family circle. "It wasn't planned," Rebecca added, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "At my age, 38, it was a surprise." "A wonderful surprise," I said, finding my voice. "Congratulations to you both." Oliver bounced in his seat. "I'm going to be a big brother, Grandma. Mom says the baby will come in spring." As Oliver chattered about names and whether he wanted a brother or sister, I watched Thomas and Rebecca. There was something different between them, a softness, a unity that hadn't been there before. Whatever had happened in the months since my departure had changed them too. After dessert, while Thomas helped Oliver with a school project, Rebecca asked me to join her in the living room. We sat across from each other, two women connected by love for the same people, but separated by so much unsaid. "I need to explain," she began, her hands twisting in her lap. "About before. About why I asked you to leave." I waited, giving her the space to find her words. "When you moved in with us after Harold died, I thought I was doing the right thing, being the supportive daughter-in-law." She looked down, but then I started feeling erased, like I was competing for my own family's attention, for my own place in my home. She took a deep breath. "My mother, Judith. She is a difficult woman, controlling, critical. Nothing I did was ever right, ever enough. When I married Thomas, I promised myself I'd never let another woman dictate how I ran my home or raised my child." Understanding began to dawn, and then I moved in. Rebecca nodded. "And you were everything my mother wasn't. Kind, supportive. Oliver adored you. Thomas looked to you for advice. You cooked meals everyone loved. You knew how to fix things, comfort people." Her voice broke. I felt like I was disappearing in my own life. The irony struck me then, how similar our fears had been. Both of us afraid of disappearing, of becoming irrelevant to the people we loved. "I never meant to take your place," I said softly. "I know that now." She wiped at her eyes. "After you left, Thomas and I started seeing a marriage counselor. I realized I was projecting my issues with my mother onto you. It wasn't fair." She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "The baby made us realize we need family, all our family, including you." "What are you saying, Rebecca?" "We're not asking you to move back in," she clarified quickly. "But I would like you to be part of our lives again, on new terms, clearer boundaries." Before I could respond, Thomas joined us, sitting beside his wife. "What Mom is trying to say," he said, using the term of endearment I hadn't heard him use for Rebecca before, "is that we'd like you to consider moving back to Burlington, not with us, but near us. There's a nice apartment complex for seniors about 10 minutes from here," Rebecca added, "independent living, but close enough that you could be part of our daily lives, part of the new baby's life from the beginning." I looked at them both, these two people who had hurt me deeply, but were now offering a bridge back. Not to what was, but to what could be. "I'd need to think about it," I said honestly. "Cedar Falls is my home, has been for a long time." "Of course," Thomas nodded. "No pressure, just consider it." When I left their house that night, Oliver hugged me fiercely. "Will you come back soon, Grandma, before the baby comes?" "I will," I promised, and meant it. The drive back to Cedar Falls gave me time to process everything. Rebecca's apology, the pregnancy, the invitation to move closer. It was more than I had hoped for, but less simple than I had imagined reconciliation might be. Back in Harold's and my house, I sat in the living room listening to the steady tick of the grandfather clock I'd repaired. For the first time, I allowed myself to really look at this house, this life I was clinging to. Every corner held memories of Harold, yes, but it also held echoes of a life that no longer existed. The large dining table where we'd hosted countless family dinners, the spare bedrooms that once held visiting friends and family, the sprawling garden designed for a woman with the energy of someone decades younger. Was I staying because this was truly where I belonged now, or because leaving felt like letting go of Harold? I thought of what Margaret had said about my resurrection. Perhaps resurrection didn't mean rebuilding the exact same life, but creating something new from the essential parts of the old. The next morning, I called a real estate agent, not to list the house, I wasn't ready for that, but to discuss its value, the current market, what might be possible. Then I called Margaret. "They want me to move back to Burlington," I told her over coffee at her kitchen table. "Not with them, near them." Margaret studied me over her reading glasses. "And what do you want, Eleanor?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to be near Oliver and the new baby, but another part is afraid," she finished for me. "Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of giving up your independence, afraid of change." I nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Fear is a poor compass, Eleanor," she said, reaching for my hand. "It'll keep you safe, but it won't take you anywhere worth going." Over the next month, I visited Burlington 3 more times. I toured the apartment complex Rebecca had mentioned, modern, comfortable, with gardens and a community center where I could potentially teach piano again. I had dinner with Thomas and his family, each visit less strained than the last. During one visit, Rebecca took me aside. "I want you to know something," she said. "If you decide to move here, this would be your decision, your life. I promise to respect your space, your relationship with Oliver and the baby. I'm not that person anymore." I believed her. Not just because of her words, but because I could see the change in her. A new confidence, a security in her role that hadn't been there before. In December, 4 months after leaving Burlington, I made my decision. The Cedar Falls house went on the market just after New Year's. By February, it had sold to a young family with 2 small children and a dog, a house that needed to be filled with life again. I moved into Riverside Apartments in Burlington in early March, just 6 weeks before Rebecca's due date. My new home was smaller but perfect for one person. A bright living room with space for Harold's grandfather clock and my piano, a kitchen where I could still bake Oliver's favorite cookies, a bedroom that didn't echo with absence. On April 12th, Sarah Eleanor Bennett was born, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, with Thomas's chin and Rebecca's eyes. When they placed her in my arms at the hospital, I felt a circle completing. Not the same circle that had broken with Harold's death, but a new one, encompassing past and future. "We gave her your name," Rebecca said softly, "because we want her to be strong and resilient, like her grandmother." Tears filled my eyes as I looked down at this new life. "Thank you," was all I could manage. Today, Sarah is 3 months old. I visit Thomas and Rebecca's home twice a week, regular visits that we all look forward to, but that maintain the boundaries we've all learned are necessary. Oliver comes to my apartment after school on Thursdays for piano lessons, a compromise Rebecca suggested herself. Rebecca and I have coffee together occasionally, building a relationship that's not quite friendship yet, but something equally valuable. A mutual respect born of understanding each other's vulnerabilities. Last week, she asked me about Harold's clock repair hobby. "Thomas says you fixed that grandfather clock yourself," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "That's impressive, Eleanor." "Harold left good notes," I replied, "and I discovered I have a knack for understanding how things fit together." I hesitated, then added, "I could show you sometime, if you're interested." Her smile was warm, real. "I'd like that." As for Thomas, our relationship has changed too. He's no longer caught between wife and mother, forced to choose sides in a battle no one could win. There's an ease between us now, a return to the closeness we had before, but with a new maturity on both sides. Yesterday, I sat in my new living room, sunlight streaming through windows that face east, toward the future, as Margaret would say. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time not as loss, but as movement forward. On my piano sat photographs, Harold in his workshop, Thomas and Rebecca on their wedding day, Oliver at his school concert, baby Sarah sleeping in her crib. Not the same family I had before, not the role I expected to play, but my family nonetheless, evolving into something new that has room for all of us. The pain of that morning in Rebecca's kitchen, "Stay away from our marriage, Eleanor," has faded, not because it wasn't real, but because it led to something necessary. A recalibration of boundaries, expectations, and love itself. I've learned that family isn't a fixed entity, but a living thing that grows, changes, and sometimes requires pruning to remain healthy. I've learned that love doesn't diminish when shared differently, and that sometimes stepping back is the most loving thing you can do. Most importantly, I've learned that even at 67, life can begin again. Differently, yes. Imperfectly, certainly. But with a richness I never expected to find after Harold's death. The bags I packed that day didn't lead to an ending as I feared. They led to a beginning. Painful, uncertain, but ultimately healing. There is wisdom in knowing when to leave, and courage in knowing how to return. Transformed, humble, and ready to love in a new way. And if you're facing your own moment of painful truth with family, remember this. Sometimes the greatest act of love is giving others the space to find their way back to you. The journey may be longer and different than you imagined, but the destination, understanding, respect, and a deeper love, is worth every step. Have you ever had to step away from someone you love to save the relationship? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. As I sit here in my apartment, watching the spring rain against my windows, I think about the journey that brought me here. Not just the physical move from Cedar Falls to Burlington, but the emotional distance traveled. From devastation to rebuilding, from rejection to reconciliation. Last night, Thomas called with a question that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Would I be willing to watch Sarah overnight this weekend so he and Rebecca could celebrate their anniversary? "You're the only one we trust," he said, the words healing something deep within me. Of course I said yes. Tomorrow my apartment will be filled with baby things, the portable crib, the diaper bag, the endless supplies that such a tiny person seems to require. Oliver will come too, excited for our grandma sleepover, as he calls it. This morning I found myself preparing not just the practical arrangements, but my heart. How strange life is, how it circles back with new opportunities disguised as familiar challenges. Once again, I'll be caring for my son's child, but this time with clear boundaries and mutual respect. I think of Rebecca, how far we've both come. Last week, she brought Sarah to my piano lesson with Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter. She sat quietly in the corner, watching as I guided small fingers across the keys. Afterward, she asked if I would consider teaching a beginner's class for adults at the community center. "I always wanted to learn," she admitted. "My mother thought it was a waste of time." The Rebecca who had ordered me out of her home would never have revealed such vulnerability. The Eleanor who left that day might have felt vindicated by this admission. Instead, I felt only compassion and a desire to help her claim something she'd been denied. "We could start with just you," I offered. "See if you enjoy it before committing to a class." Her smile, uncertain but hopeful, reminded me of Oliver when he masters a difficult piece after weeks of practice. This new relationship we're building isn't what I imagined when I first moved in with them after Harold's death. It's more measured, more conscious. We no longer assume understanding, but work to create it. We no longer take for granted our places in each other's lives, but acknowledge them as the precious gifts they are. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the deepest wounds lead to the most profound healing? How would you handle rebuilding trust with someone who hurt you deeply? The greatest lesson in all of this has been about identity, how easily we define ourselves by our relationships to others. Harold's wife, Thomas's mother, Oliver's grandmother. When those roles change, through death, distance, or conflict, we're forced to ask, who am I without these definitions? I'm still discovering the answer. I'm Eleanor Bennett, yes. Still Harold's widow, Thomas's mother, Oliver and Sarah's grandmother. But I'm also a piano teacher again, a clock repair hobbyist, a friend to Margaret and her circle of resilient women, a neighbor who brings soup when someone is ill, a volunteer who reads to children at the library every Friday. I'm a woman who packed her bags and left when asked, but found the courage to return on new terms. A woman who learned that dignity doesn't mean refusing to forgive, but refusing to live without authenticity. Last Sunday, I attended church for the first time since Harold's funeral. Not the large Presbyterian church Thomas and Rebecca attend, but a small Methodist chapel near my apartment. I went alone, sat in the back, and let the familiar hymns wash over me. An elderly gentleman, perhaps 80, with a cane and a carefully pressed suit, nodded to me from across the aisle. After the service, he introduced himself as Robert, a widower of 5 years. "First time's the hardest," he said, not explaining whether he meant first time at a new church or first time doing anything alone after losing a spouse. Perhaps both. "Does it get easier?" I asked. He considered this, leaning on his cane. "Not easier. Different. You build a life around the hole, not to fill it. Nothing fills it. But to honor it by continuing to live." His words stayed with me, their simple truth resonating with my experience. We build a life around the hole. The absence of Harold, the changed relationship with Thomas, the lost dream of what I thought my later years would be. Not to deny these losses, but to create something new that acknowledges them while refusing to be defined solely by them. This afternoon, I have a new piano student coming, a woman in her 50s who recently retired and is finally pursuing the musical education her family couldn't afford when she was young. There's something profoundly moving about witnessing someone reach for a long-deferred dream. Before she arrives, I'll make tea in the blue pottery mugs Harold and I collected during our travels. I'll open the windows to let in the spring air. I'll place fresh flowers, daffodils from the community garden, on the piano. Small rituals of welcome, of continuity, of life persisting. The grandfather clock in my living room chimes the quarter hour, the sound both familiar and new in this space. I've become adept at adjusting its mechanism when the temperature changes affect its timing. Harold would be proud of this unexpected skill I've developed, this connection to him I maintain through caring for the things he loved. Sometimes I talk to him still, especially in the quiet evenings when the day's activities are done. Not in grief anymore, but in the comfortable way of someone continuing a lifelong conversation. I tell him about Sarah's first smile, about Oliver's growing talent at the piano, about the fragile new understanding between Rebecca and me. "You'd like her if you got to know her," I told him recently, meaning Rebecca. "She's stronger than I gave her credit for. Braver." I like to think he hears me, not from some distant heaven, but from the part of my heart where he'll always reside. The part that knows what he would say, how he would laugh, what advice he would offer. This evening, Thomas will stop by with some photographs he's framed for me. Pictures of Sarah's first weeks, of Oliver holding his baby sister, of all of us together at her christening. He's been doing this lately, making sure I have tangible connections to family moments, even those I wasn't present for. It's his way of saying, "You belong with us. Your place is secure. We want you in our story." Such a contrast to that autumn morning when Rebecca said, "Stay away from our marriage, Eleanor. You're not welcome here." Both statements were true in their time. Both reflected real feelings, real needs. The difference is that we've all grown enough to understand that family relationships aren't static. They expand and contract. They require negotiation and renegotiation as circumstances change. The wisdom comes in recognizing when to hold on and when to let go, when to speak and when to listen, when to leave and when to return. As I prepare for my new student, arranging music sheets and adjusting the piano bench, I feel a sense of purpose that I thought I'd lost forever. Not the same purpose I had as Harold's wife or as a younger mother, but equally valid, equally fulfilling. There's a quote I read recently that resonated deeply. The second half of life is not about building and creating your identity. It's about shedding the identities you've built up, letting go of the roles and self-images that have defined you. Perhaps that's the journey I've been on, learning to let go of who I thought I was supposed to be in order to discover who I am now in this new chapter. Not Eleanor as wife or Eleanor as live-in grandmother, but simply Eleanor, still connected to those I love but also distinct, with my own path to walk. The doorbell rings, my student arriving. I smooth my skirt, check my reflection briefly in the hall mirror, and go to welcome her into my home. This small act, opening my door to someone new, feels symbolic of the larger opening I've created in my life. As I guide her through her first tentative notes on the piano, I'm reminded of something Harold often said: "Music doesn't get used up, Ellie. The more you share it, the more there is." The same, I'm learning, is true of love. Even when it changes form, even when it requires distance before finding a new way to connect, even when it leads us places we never expected to go. The bags I packed that day weren't an ending. They were the beginning of a journey back to myself, and eventually, back to a family transformed by our shared willingness to begin again. And isn't that the most profound truth about love? That it can survive even our most painful mistakes if we're brave enough to acknowledge them, learn from them, and try again with wiser hearts. If you've ever had to rebuild a relationship from the ground up, I'd love to hear what helped you find your way back to connection. Sometimes sharing our stories is the first step toward healing. As spring turns to summer in Vermont, I find myself reflecting on seasons, not just the external changing of weather and landscape, but the internal seasons of a life. Winter's barrenness giving way to spring's tentative growth, the full bloom of summer fading into autumn's bittersweet beauty, and then winter again, the cycle continuing. Harold and I moved to Cedar Falls in autumn 40 years ago. We raised Thomas through all seasons, watched him grow and leave, celebrated when he found Rebecca, and built his own family. Then came the winter of Harold's death, a season I thought would never end. But seasons do change, even when we believe they won't, even when we can't imagine warmth returning to frozen ground. Today, I sat in Thomas and Rebecca's backyard, watching Oliver push Sarah in the baby swing Thomas installed last weekend. Sarah's laughter, a new sound just discovered in the past few weeks, bubbled up like spring water, infectious and pure. "Higher, Ollie, higher!" he commanded himself in a high voice, pretending to be his sister, though she can't yet form these words. His gentleness with her, his protective pride, reminds me so much of Thomas at that age when his cousins would visit. Rebecca brought out lemonade and sat beside me on the patio, both of us content in the shared silence of watching children at play. How different from the tense silences we once endured, each of us afraid of saying the wrong thing, of overstepping invisible boundaries. "She looks more like you every day," I remarked, noting Sarah's thoughtful expression, the way she observed everything with serious concentration before breaking into delighted smiles. "Thomas says the same thing," Rebecca nodded, "but I see you in her too. The way she listens to music, how still she becomes when someone plays the piano." This simple observation, generous, inclusive, would have been impossible a year ago when Rebecca saw my influence as a threat rather than a gift. "Thank you," I said, meaning for more than the compliment. She understood. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Indeed we have. From stay away from our marriage to this peaceful coexistence, this growing friendship. Not without effort, not without occasional missteps, but with a shared commitment to creating something better than what we had before. Last week, I experienced another milestone in this new season of my life. Robert, the gentleman from church, invited me to attend a chamber music concert at the community college. Not a date, he was careful to clarify, but the companionship of someone who might appreciate Dvorak. I accepted, after a moment of hesitation that had nothing to do with Robert himself and everything to do with the strangeness of going anywhere with a man who wasn't Harold. We met at the concert hall, sat side by side listening to the music wash over us, and afterward shared coffee and conversation about the performance. It was pleasant, comfortable, entirely without pressure or expectation, just two people of a certain age enjoying culture and conversation, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When Thomas called the next day and I mentioned the concert, there was a brief pause before he said, "That's great, Mom. Really great." I heard the question he wasn't asking. "Robert is a friend, Thomas, a widower who enjoys classical music, nothing more." "Even if it were more," he said carefully, "that would be okay, you know. Dad would want you to be happy." His words touched me deeply, this permission I hadn't sought but somehow needed to hear. Not that I'm ready for romance or even looking for it, but the acknowledgement that my life continues, that connection in all its forms remains possible, was a gift I hadn't expected from my son. It's strange how grief and growth intertwine, how loss opens doors we never knew existed. Had Harold lived, I might never have experienced the painful rupture with Rebecca that led eventually to deeper understanding. I might never have discovered my ability to repair clocks, to live independently, to rebuild a life I thought was finished. This isn't to say I wouldn't trade it all in an instant to have Harold back. I would. But since that isn't possible, I've learned to recognize the growth that can come from even the most devastating losses. Yesterday, I received a letter from Margaret. She's considering selling her house in Cedar Falls and moving to Florida to be near her daughter. "The winters get harder every year," she wrote, "and I want to know my grandchildren while I still have my wits about me." I understand her decision completely, though I'll miss our weekly phone calls and her no-nonsense wisdom. We promised to visit each other, knowing such promises are easier made than kept at our age, with health and circumstances always uncertain. Her potential departure reminds me how fragile our connections are, how important it is to nurture them while we can. It's why I treasure these summer afternoons with Thomas's family, why I make time for my piano students, why I've joined a book club at my apartment complex despite initially feeling shy among strangers. Because in the end, what else matters but the lives we touch and those who touch ours in return? The grandfather clock chimes 7 o'clock, reminding me it's time for my evening routine. A light supper, perhaps some reading, a call to Oliver to wish him good night. Simple pleasures that punctuate my days now. As I prepare to leave Thomas and Rebecca's home, Sarah reaches for me from her high chair, babbling excitedly. I take her in my arms, this child who bears my name and carries forward something of Harold in me into a future we won't see. "Ba-ba-ba," she says solemnly, patting my cheek with sticky fingers. "Yes, darling," I reply. "Grandma loves you too." Rebecca walks me to my car, Sarah now transferred to her arms. "Same time Thursday?" She confirms our standing arrangement. "I'll be here," I promise, knowing this simple commitment means everything. To Oliver, who waits for our piano lessons, to Sarah, who lights up at the sound of my voice, to Thomas, who no longer has to choose between wife and mother, and to Rebecca herself, who has made room for me in a way that once seemed impossible. As I drive the short distance to my apartment, I think about what I might have told my younger self if I could reach back through time to that devastating morning when Rebecca asked me to leave. I would say, "This pain has purpose. This ending creates space for a new beginning. This rejection will lead to reconciliation, though not in the way you expect or on the timeline you would choose. Most of all, I would say, you are stronger than you know. You will not just survive this. You will grow from it in ways you cannot yet imagine." The evening light casts long shadows across Burlington as I park in my designated spot at Riverside Apartments. Mrs. Chen from across the hall waves from her balcony where she's watering her impressive collection of orchids. Robert, returning from walking his small terrier, tips his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. This place has become home in ways I didn't expect when I first moved here. Not a consolation prize or a compromise, but a genuine community where I belong. Inside my apartment, I move through my evening routine with the comfortable rhythm of established habits. I prepare a simple salad, listen to the evening news, call Oliver as promised. Later, I'll sit at the piano for an hour, practicing pieces I'm teaching, and others I play purely for pleasure. As I wash my dinner dishes, I glance at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Next weekend is circled in red, Thomas and Rebecca's anniversary. They've asked if they can drop the children with me overnight so they can celebrate at a hotel in Montreal. A small thing, perhaps, but significant in what it represents. Trust rebuilt, relationships reconfigured, a new normal established. I think about how far we've all come from that autumn morning when my bags stood packed in their hallway. The journey hasn't been easy or straightforward. There have been awkward moments, misunderstandings, old patterns reasserting themselves when we least expect it. But there has also been grace, that indefinable quality that allows people to begin again, to see each other with new eyes, to forgive not just others, but themselves for human frailty. As night falls over Burlington, I sit at my piano, fingers finding the keys of a Chopin nocturne Harold particularly loved. The music fills my apartment, melancholy yet beautiful, complex with emotion yet ultimately resolving into peace. Like life itself, I think. Like love that endures even when its form must change. The bags I packed that day led not to an ending, but to this moment. Fingers on piano keys, heart full with the day's simple joys, mind at peace with a past I cannot change, and a future I continue to create, one day at a time. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after loss or rejection, know that you're not alone. The path forward isn't always clear, and healing rarely follows a straight line. But with time, with courage, with willingness to begin again, transformation is possible. Even from our deepest wounds can come unexpected gifts. Even from our most painful goodbyes can come new hellos. Even from bags packed in sorrow can come journeys that lead, eventually, home. Not to the home we once knew or expected, but to one we build ourselves. With wisdom earned through suffering, with boundaries born of necessity, and with love that proves itself more resilient than we ever imagined possible. As summer deepens in Vermont, the days grow longer and more languid. The community garden at Riverside Apartments has burst into vibrant color, a testament to collective care and patience. I've taken responsibility for the herb section, something I never had space for in our Cedar Falls yard but always wanted to try. There's something deeply satisfying about running my fingers through rosemary and thyme, inhaling their fragrance, then bringing small bundles back to my kitchen. Harold would have appreciated this new interest. He always encouraged my curiosity, my willingness to learn new skills regardless of age. "You're never too old for a new hobby," he would say, especially after retirement when he discovered his passion for clock repair. Now I understand what he meant, how engaging with something new keeps the mind sharp, the spirit young. This morning, I had a surprise visitor, Rebecca, without the children, carrying a folder and looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said when I opened the door. "I should have called first." "Not at all," I assured her, genuinely pleased by her unexpected appearance. "Come in, would you like coffee?" As I prepared our drinks, she sat at my small dining table, the folder placed precisely before her. Something about her posture, straight-backed, hands clasped, reminded me of a student preparing for an examination. "I wanted to show you something," she said when I joined her, "and ask your opinion." She opened the folder to reveal architectural drawings, detailed plans for what appeared to be a home renovation. For a moment, I was confused. Were they remodeling? Moving? "These are preliminary designs," she explained, spreading the papers out, "for an addition to our house, a mother-in-law suite." I looked up sharply, meeting her eyes. "Not as a suggestion you should live with us," she clarified quickly. "Your apartment is your home, and we all respect that. But for visits, for times when you might want to stay over with the children, for holidays when family comes." She turned to a detailed floor plan. It would have its own entrance, a small kitchenette, a private bathroom, connected to the main house but separate, a space that could be yours when you're there, but that could also serve other purposes when you're not. I studied the drawings, noting the thoughtfulness of the design, how it would connect to the garden I'd helped plant, how the windows would catch morning light, how it provided both privacy and proximity. "Thomas doesn't know I'm showing you this," Rebecca continued. "He and I have discussed the addition, but the specific design, I wanted your input before we finalized anything." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on me. A year ago, Rebecca had seen my presence as an invasion. Now she was literally building a space where I could belong, on terms that respected everyone's boundaries. "It's beautiful," I said finally, genuinely moved. "You've put a lot of thought into this." "Too much, probably," she admitted with a small laugh. "I've redesigned it about 20 times. May I ask why now?" The question wasn't challenging, merely curious. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering. After Sarah was born, I started thinking about family differently, about what it means to create a legacy, to build connections that outlast us. She met my eyes directly. "I didn't have that growing up. My mother, well, you know some of that story. But I want it for my children. I want them to know what it means to be part of something larger than just our immediate family." She hesitated, then continued. "And I realized something else. The fear I had when you lived with us, that you would somehow replace me, that Thomas and Oliver would prefer you. It came from my own insecurity, not from anything you did." "We all have those fears," I said gently, "in different forms." She nodded. "The thing is, Eleanor, you're Sarah's only grandmother. My mother, she's not involved by her choice, and I don't want Sarah to miss out on that relationship because of my past issues." I reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Thank you for this, for everything it represents." We spent the next hour discussing the plans, making small adjustments, a bookshelf here, a window seat there. Not as designer and client, but as two women collaborating on a space that symbolized our new relationship. When she left, promising to return with Thomas to discuss the project further, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced since before Harold's death. Not that grief had ended, it never truly does, but that life had expanded around it, making room for new connections, new possibilities. That afternoon, I had my regular piano lesson with Oliver. He's progressing remarkably well, showing a natural musicality that reminds me of Thomas at his age. Today, he was working on a simplified version of Beethoven's Für Elise, his brow furrowed in concentration as his fingers sought the correct keys. "Grandma," he said during a break, "did you know Mom is taking piano lessons too?" This was news to me. "Is she?" He nodded vigorously. "With Ms. Abernathy at the community center. She practices when she thinks no one's listening, but I can hear her. She's not as good as you," he added loyally, "but she's trying really hard." Another surprise in a day full of them. Rebecca, who had once seen my musical influence on Oliver as an intrusion, was now pursuing the art herself. "That's wonderful," I told him. "Music is something you can enjoy your whole life." "That's what Mom said," he replied, before returning to his practice with renewed determination. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang. Thomas calling outside our usual Sunday schedule. "Mom," he began without preamble, "Rebecca told me she showed you the plans today." "Yes," I confirmed. "They're beautiful, Thomas. Very thoughtful." "It was her idea," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "All of it. The addition, asking for your input, everything." "She's come a long way," I observed. "We all have." There was a pause. Then he asked the question I sensed had been on his mind. "Are you happy, Mom, with how things are now?" The question deserved careful consideration. Am I happy? Not in the uncomplicated way I was when Harold was alive and our family seemed complete and untroubled, but happy in a different way, more complex, more hard-won. "I'm at peace," I answered finally. "I found my place again, different from before, but real. And yes, there's happiness in that. I worry, sometimes," he admitted, that I hurt you too deeply, that underneath everything you still feel that rejection." His honesty opened a door I'd thought closed between us. "There are scars," I acknowledged, "for all of us, but scars aren't wounds anymore, Thomas. They're evidence of healing." After we hung up, I stood at my window looking out at Burlington's lights twinkling in the summer darkness. So much had changed in a year. The woman who had packed her bags in shame and hurt, certain her family life was over, could never have imagined this rebuilding, this reconciliation. Not perfect, nothing human ever is, but genuine, thoughtful, intentional. The next morning brought another surprise, a text message from Rebecca. "Piano lesson this afternoon? If you're free. If not, no pressure." And so it began, a new tradition, a new connection. Every Wednesday afternoon, Rebecca comes to my apartment for an hour. She's a dedicated student, practicing diligently between lessons, accepting correction with grace. We talk about music, yes, but also about other things, her design projects, Sarah's development, books we've both enjoyed. Slowly, carefully, we're building something neither of us had before, a friendship based not on obligation or family connection, but on genuine interest and growing affection. Summer flows into fall. The addition to Thomas and Rebecca's home breaks ground in September, a tangible symbol of our new family configuration. Oliver starts 7th grade, suddenly taller, his voice occasionally cracking with the first signs of adolescence. Sarah takes her first steps, lurching between furniture pieces with determined concentration. And I continue creating this second life, teaching piano to students aged 8 to 80, volunteering at the library's Children's Hour, occasionally attending concerts or films with Robert, who remains a kind friend without complication or pressure. One crisp October afternoon, almost exactly a year after I packed my bags and left Thomas and Rebecca's home, I find myself walking through Burlington's waterfront park. The leaves have turned to brilliant reds and golds. The air carries that distinctive autumn scent of apples and wood smoke. I sit on a bench overlooking Lake Champlain, watching sailboats catch the late afternoon breeze. A young couple walks past, pushing a stroller, laughing together at some private joke. An elderly man throws bread to insistent seagulls. 2 women jog by, deep in conversation. All these lives intersecting briefly, each with their own complex stories, their own wounds and healings, their own journeys forward. My phone chimes with a text from Thomas. "Addition framing complete. Want to come see this weekend?" I type back, "Wouldn't miss it." As I slip my phone back into my pocket, I'm struck by how ordinary this exchange is. A son inviting his mother to see a home improvement project. Nothing remarkable on the surface. Yet behind it lies a story of rupture and repair, of words that cut, "Stay away from our marriage, Eleanor," and the long, patient work of finding a new way to be family. The bags I packed that day a year ago led not to an ending, but to a beginning I couldn't have imagined. Not a perfect happy ending like in fairy tales, but something more valuable, a genuine human story of fallibility, forgiveness, and the courage to try again. If you're facing rejection from those you love, if you've had to pack your bags literally or figuratively, know this: endings can become beginnings. Wounds can heal into wisdom. And sometimes the journey away becomes the necessary first step on the path back, not to what was, but to what might be if we're brave enough to build it together. As the sun begins to set over Lake Champlain, painting the water in shades of orange and pink, I stand to make my way home. My home. The apartment that represents not compromise or consolation, but choice, independence, a life rebuilt on my own terms. Tomorrow, I'll visit Thomas and Rebecca's house to see the progress on the addition, the physical space being created to match the emotional space we've all worked to build. I'll hold Sarah, listen to Oliver's latest piano piece, share coffee with Rebecca, discuss design details with Thomas. Family, different than before, harder won, more consciously created, but family nonetheless. The bags I packed that day taught me the most valuable lesson of my later years, that love, like the grandfather clock I repaired, sometimes needs to be taken apart before it can work properly again, each piece examined, each connection tested, each function restored with patience and care. And when reassembled, it keeps better time than before. If this story touched your heart, like and share, because sometimes hearing another woman's pain is what makes us feel less alone.